I've been a martial artist for about 30-something years now. And since I started doing weapon sparring in martial arts, relatively within the last 5-6 years or so, there's been an attitude that I've encountered quite often that I've often found kind of disturbing, and depending on who I'm talking to or the person saying it, is honestly kind of low-key condescending. That attitude being a certain level of disrespect to lightsaber combat. Now, before you shake your heads, let me explain. Lightsabers have been popular since the 1970s with the first Star Wars movie, and it's easy to see why. They're flashy and bright, fake swords that look cool and sound even cooler. The sound alone is iconic enough to be recognized anywhere in the world. However, it's only been within the last 30 years or so that it's actually become something of a combat sport. By that, I mean that there have actually been schools and clubs who are dedicated to practicing and doing lightsaber combat as a recreational activity or as an actual combat martial art. In fact, this was something I didn't even realize how big it was until I moved out to the Southwest and found a couple of lightsaber clubs here. I talked with the people who run them, and they've given me some of the history behind it. Now, as a Star Wars fan, I'm already somewhat of where they come from and where they're bringing their information from as well. But that being said, it's thanks to the popularity of the prequels and the millennials particularly that it inspired that have carried lightsaber combat forward into their adulthood, so that now that even in places like France and Italy, it's more or less recognized as a combat sport officially. So no more nerds fighting in the backyards here. Well, sort of anyway. This also coincided with the rise of HEMA, in which I also include in that category Boohurst, which is full armored combat fighting, and SCA, which does 14th century era battlefield and dueling combat with armor, but using rattan sticks instead of actual swords, and using spears made of wood but with rubber tips instead of metal tips. And also too, it coincides with the rise of Comic Cons, where fans started out coming out publicly in open display and celebration of their favorite fandoms with elaborate costumes and designs that were not cheap to make. However, many of the teachers who do historical fencing seem to show little respect towards lightsaber combat because of its Hollywood origins and its flashy movesets that seem to them, if not barely historical, then entirely impractical. And I think that this attitude is just wrong, in my opinion. To start with, the original Star Wars movie based their lightsaber scenes on traditional kenjutsu. This Japanese influence is seen constantly throughout the franchise since then via the various stances and power strikes which look similar to or are taken from Japanese sword fighting. It only became flashy during the making of Empire Strikes Back, when it was felt that it needed to make the combat more exciting, as it were. Thus, what we see in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, as much as the actors' brief scenes of dialogue. The prequels then further upped the ante when they decided that lightsaber combat needed to show a much higher skill level for the Jedi at their prime, rather than when they're almost extinct, as in the original trilogy. And it's here, I think, where a lot of the issues start with people who don't like it. Based on conversations that I've had and some stuff that I've read, it tends to be rooted in the fact that they focus so much on flourishing flips and spins that to some professional martial artists it just seems both ridiculous and impractical, almost like a circus performance in a way. Often pointing out that one needs simply just keep their guard up or point the blade on the person consistently to defeat such flashy moves, stabbing them when their back is turned, or just sniping the limbs whenever they become open after making some wide attack of some sort. To be fair to these criticisms though, those are also legit points in many cases. For example, in college I once fought a very proficient Taekwondo fighter from Korea who was extremely quick with his kick and nearly took my head off doing a jumping spin kick. However, when he then tried to do the move a second time, I simply employed a simple front kick from my lead leg while he was in midair, and he came crashing to the ground in a heap and was thoroughly embarrassed and never fought me again. However, there are some other martial artists that do employ similar techniques to the flashy lightsaber moves that we see in the movies. One need only look at what the 7 forms of traditional lightsaber combat from the movies individually are supposed to focus on to find real-world applications that arguably may have inspired their creation or looks very, very similar from it. For example, Form 1 focuses on disarming limbs and is more of a battlefield technique with large sweeping strikes against multiple people. Form 2 is a classic dueling-centric style that focuses on economy of movement and lack of wide sweeping slashes and acrobatics in favor of simple cut and thrust motions and short stabbing motions. While Form 3 is a strictly defensive style that solely focuses on tight inner defense close to the body. Form 4 is your stereotypical acrobatic high energy and wide slash movements that we all associate with lightsaber combat. Form 5 is an offensive-centric power-based style that is designed to counterattack with overwhelming force to end the fight very quickly. While as Form 6 is a hybrid of all the previous styles, but short of master level. And Form 7, the final one, being a hybrid like 6, but is more emotionally and rage-driven with a complete focus on dominating the opponent with no thought of defense. It's also considered the coolest lightsaber style out there as well, so just FYI. In all these styles, you can find traces of real martial arts swordsmanship from across the world that have one or more of these elements incorporated into their style. And that's one of the reasons why lightsaber combat is so appealing. Essentially, that someone can literally learn various historical swordsmanship to a degree through this fictional style of combat that's less than a century old. Now, a large part of the problem, I think, is that if opponents to lightsaber combat do find anything remotely close to being historically accurate, they often feel like it dilutes the purity of the traditional style that it's based off of or mimicking. Many of these people are trying to either keep a long-standing martial arts alive with its lineage and history preserved, or are trying to resurrect long-dead styles that haven't been done in centuries and thus are forced to use old manuscripts to try and rebuild it from its DNA. Nothing wrong with any of those ones in and of themselves. So, therefore, they rely so much on these texts, or living traditions or teachers, that any move that is not taught by someone directly or recorded and written down somewhere means absolutely nothing. And again, in their defense, in and of themselves, there's nothing wrong with that particular preference. If you prefer stuff that comes from the real world, that's perfectly fine. Now, for me, the thing is this. Any move, regardless of its origins, is going to have its pros and its cons. Yes, you can use a historically accurate style to defeat someone doing a lightsaber sport combat. I've done it myself. But the reverse also applies, which I've also done. Because if one becomes so entrenched in a specific set of expectations of fighting, then they will not be prepared when the other person suddenly employs a radical technique to get the kill. And when it comes to all combat forms, it is only one rule that universally applies to everybody. That being that a move only needs to work once to defeat someone else. Now, while on the surface this might seem like first world problems, and it is, I've also seen elements of this within other conflicts within the martial arts world as well. Traditional rapier versus Olympic rapier, for example, or traditional HEMA with written sources versus HEMA with sources that are too far from the era that it's speaking about. Various kenjutsu styles refusing to spar, period, because of the uncertainty about the rules that they're engaging in or for fear of embarrassing their art, and how some traditional martial arts look at modern martial arts such as Aikido versus MMA as my one Aikido teacher said, human dogfighting. I am a firm believer that, quite frankly, all of this is just stupid. Again, it's fine to have a preference, but that preference is not gospel, just like a movie or historical text is not gospel. There are always examples within and outside of both that won't fit in their wheelhouse but still might work from time to time, or if it's done at the right time. All martial arts are about adaptation and learning. Growth is inevitable the longer the style is around and encounters different people, eras, and circumstances. And I say that lightsaber combat, despite its origins, is just a natural evolution of that process. And even if there's some disagreement, I think that should at least be recognized that there is common ground as a martial arts goes. And as a plus, what's wrong with people learning about other historical martial arts through something that's fictional? Something that actually makes it digestible and not just a bunch of homework. But that's my opinion on that.